Hello and welcome to the Business of Podcast. I'm Deepak, joining you from India and excited to host today's episode. It's truly pleasure to have Dr. Ericka Johnson joins us as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Dr. Ericka Johnson is the Deputy Head of Department and Professor of Gender and Society at Linköping University, Sweden, whose work sits at the crossroads of technology, medicine, and gender. Drawing on science and technology studies and feminist technoscience, she examines how technologies from AI and care robots to medical simulators and pharmaceuticals shape bodies, identities, and social norms. Her books include a cultural biography of the prostate, reflecting through technology and gender in drugs, feminist studies of pharmaceuticals, which trace how medical technologies and data practices make certain bodies visible while marginalizing others. She also plays a leading role in the Wallenberg AI, Autonomous Systems and Software Program, Humanity and Society, where she guides interdisciplinary research on the social and ethical dimensions of AI. Today, Dr. Ericka Johnson joins us to discuss her fascinating research, useful and transparent synthetic data. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ericka Johnson to the podcast. Dr. Ericka, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak. And it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Professor, to begin, could you explain what synthetic data is? And then narrow is on tabular synthetic data in particular, how it is generated and why it is so widely used.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thanks for letting me be here. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk about synthetic data with your audience. And you're totally right. We should start out with explaining what synthetic data is. I am pretty sure that all of us have seen synthetic data in action and probably interacted with it. So, for example, all of the text elements that come out of ChatGPT are synthetic data. All of the generated images that we see in a lot of our social media feeds are also, all of the synthetic ones are synthetic data. And this is the type of synthetic data that gained a lot of traction early on, partly because developers of autonomous systems, like self-driving cars, needed more image data for the computer vision algorithms to train on. But there are also people using generative AI to make synthetic tabular data. For synthetic tabular data, specially developed AI models will learn the patterns and relationships in a data set and then generate a new data set that mimics the original, but with slight differences and all synthetic data points. Or at least that is the goal, which we'll get back to later. But why would you do that, one can ask? Well, this type of synthetic data is being made and used for several different reasons. One of the most common is because people often want to share their data with collaborators or research partners in other places, but many times there are data sharing regulations and laws or even internal policies within an organization in place that restrict data sharing or transporting data across regional or nation-state borders, or even between divisions within a company from research and development to marketing, for example. And in these situations, some people are finding that synthetic data is a way to share data without sharing data. It sounds crazy, but this is the idea. Another reason to use synthetic data is to ensure privacy. I think the academic answer of whether or not synthetic data can really do this is still up for debate, but this is one of the selling features of synthetic data. Because the new data set comprises all new and generated data points, at least in the imaginary, there are no actual people or real sensitive data in it, and thus it is perfectly safe to share or distribute. You don't risk revealing anyone's personal data because there is nobody's personal data in it. Again, I think the jury is still out on that, but this is what people are saying. A third reason why you might want synthetic data is because it can be used to augment or amplify, that is, to make larger an existing data set. Many people are keen to harness the power of machine learning in their domain and company right now. And even though many people have a lot of data, most of us do not have the incredibly large amounts of data that machine learning requires. So to fix that, a person could produce synthetic data in large amounts, add it to existing data, and have what is called an augmented or amplified data set to use for training data. Now, keep in mind that for all of these uses, portability, privacy assurance, and dataset amplification or augmentation, the synthetic dataset needs to mimic, but not mirror, the original dataset. And if your new dataset is exactly the same as your real one, then it will not be able to avoid data regulations, it will not ensure privacy, nor will it contain any new information or variations for a machine learning algorithm to learn. The synthetic data set needs to have different data points than the original.
Professor, in your current research, what have you done to investigate the quality and behavior of tabular synthetic data? And what key findings have emerged so far, especially regarding edge cases, mode collapse, and phenomena such as intersectional hallucinations, impossible variations, and the broader relationship between the world and its data representations?
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the chance to explain why I got into this really interesting rabbit hole. So I have had for many years in my research a really strong interest in how bodies and identities or subjectivities, we sometimes call it, are represented in, among other things, medical data. It's very much a medical humanities type of approach that has been looking at how different bodies, for example, male bodies and female bodies, actually are represented in medical data. And not surprisingly, we know that female bodies are often much less represented in medical data, largely because we have for decades not wanted to do clinical testing on bodies which might be pregnant and where clinical trials could possibly harm a fetus, and also because we have different understandings about what the normative or normal human body is. So we know that much medical data does not represent the half of the population in the world. Now, a few years ago, I started hearing in my medical humanities bubble ideas from people working in the medical domain that synthetic data might be a way to really address some of the big problems in medical data and imbalances in the data. Part of what was being talked about was the idea that synthetic data, like I mentioned earlier, could maybe assure privacy, and we would be able to synthesize lots of patient data, epidemiological data, patient records, and do it in a way that would ensure privacy because we would never have any real patients to expose, and thereby be able to create data sets that we could share much more easily. Now, another part of that conversation hovered around the idea of representation and the idea that maybe by using synthetic data, we could, with the computer, with AI's help, balance out the known imbalances that we have in our data sets. However, I have another bubble, which is the AI bubble, and in there, I started talking with people about these dreams of what synthetic data could do, particularly for the medical field. And a lot of people would, listen to me and just sort of nod their head and be like, yeah, maybe. But one should keep in mind what happens when you generate synthetic data, which is that you tend to have an AI learn the normal things in a data set. And I use normal in quotation marks here, but like the majority elements of a data set. And then when you synthesize or reproduce a data set in a synthetic way, the objects in the data set that are most intensely represented, they're the ones that become the most common in the synthetic data set. But all of these edge cases that you might have on the two ends of your bell curve don't necessarily make it into the data set. So I had the opportunity to do a collaboration with a machine learning expert, Dr. Sagi Haji Sharif, and she and I just ran a bunch of experiments using open access synthetic data and trying to figure out what happens when we synthesized it, or open access census data. We used the 1990 adult population data from the US because it's a very common data set that many people are quite familiar with. And census data, population data, has representations of humans. So innately for us as humans, we understand what's happening when we read that data set. And we first synthesized it using a generative adversarial network and looked and tried to see what happened to the edge cases. And we saw that, yes, actually, the edge cases disappeared. So for example, in the original data set, we had a majority of the population which had been born in the US. And in the synthetic data set, the majority of that data set also were born in the US. But in the original data set, we also had people who had immigrated to the US, but were born in foreign countries, other countries, 41 different countries. And in our synthetic data set, we had also people who immigrated to the US, were born in different countries, but we had only 32 different countries of origin. So 9 countries of origin disappeared, and suddenly we no longer had people who had been born in Japan or Hong Kong or Guam. And this is what we mean by the edge cases disappearing. Now, a lot of people trucking in synthetic data are okay with throwing the edge cases under the bus because, you kind of just want the majority part of your data anyway for a lot of people. But I'm a gender studies professor. I think edge cases are actually where it's at. So I was a little bit uncomfortable with that. And I thought, okay, we've got to totally write up a bunch of this, and start talking about it. But my colleague, who's an engineer, she's like, well, this is actually probably what's leading to mode collapse and a real big problem for training eventual AI models on this data. Let's see if we can make it better. Now, I mentioned that we had been using GANs initially, and she's like, let's try to use a diffusion model. So she did, and she ran some more experiments, and she adjusted things, and was able to get a new synthetic data set that actually had the edge cases. And, that was great. By knowing what we were looking for, because we were specifically concerned with edge cases, and by shifting the methods and the tools that we were using, we were able to maintain the edge cases. It didn't happen immediately, but we were able to do it. Okay, that said, we also started looking more intensely at what was happening in the data, in the synthetic data, not just at the edge cases. And we ended up seeing sort of, I don't know if you want to call them glitches or ripples in the data, but what we ended up calling them were intersectional hallucinations. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about this, but it happens because as you ask an AI to learn the essential elements of your data set, it typically tends to do that in the single column, like one attribute at a time. And then it reproduces the statistical representation in that column. But it doesn't necessarily keep, or can, so far it's very hard to keep all of those representations also related to the other columns and what they are. So you may have in your synthetic data set a distribution of men and women that is statistically similar to what you had in your original data set. And remember, you don't want it to be the same, you just want it to be similar. But as you shift around where in the rows those gender indicators are, they're going to shift how they're related to the other columns. And there's nothing you can do about that. Or there is some things you can do about that. You can try to keep some of the relations. Some of the models are trying to work on that, but it has to change or else you will not be having synthetic data. You will have a mirror of your data. I'm going to show, for those of you watching on YouTube, I'm going to, show you an example of this. The first experiments we did were using the US census data from 1990, but we also synthesized a version of the Swedish population data from 2017. And then we started asking intersectional questions of this, intersectionality being a concept from gender studies that reflects or tries to talk about or give light to the fact that we are very complex beings. We have an age, we have a sex, we have a geographical location, we have an educational level. Now in this picture, for those of you watching, what we see is a representation of where in Sweden, so a geographical location, the high densities of highly educated women are. And there are 2 purple spots on here that you see. One is at the city of Uppsala, and one is at the city of Lund. And these are the 2 oldest, most established university cities in Sweden. So it makes sense that you would have high densities of highly educated women in these places. Now I'm going to show you a map of the synthetic Sweden that we had generated. So this is a visualization of the data set of synthetic Sweden, and we see that these purple spotches have moved from Uppsala and Lund, they're no longer there, to a whole bunch of little municipalities on the west coast of Sweden. So in this map, we are representing the synthetic data set, and in that synthetic data set, we have a pretty good mirror of the distribution of women and men. We have a pretty good statistical representation of how highly educated women are and men are, and we have a pretty good distribution or representation of how actually where people live in Sweden. But the intersection of those three places has significantly changed. Now, in the field of machine learning and synthetic data, there are a lot of people who talk about synthetic data as containing plausible and implausible variations, and that's the term. And what you've seen in this map is not necessarily an implausible variation, because on the west coast of Sweden, there are lots of women. On the west coast of Sweden, there are lots of people who are highly educated. And in Sweden, we have lots of people who are highly educated women, but where they are located is different. So this is a perfectly fine, plausible variation for a synthetic data set, one could argue. And yet, at the same time, it actually doesn't represent where we have highly educated women in Sweden in real life. Is that okay? Maybe it depends on what you're going to use that data for. Is this just an implausible or plausible variation? Or, and here's where the philosophy of science person in me comes out, could we argue that this synthetic data set is actually containing new ontological objects? This is a conversation that we're not having in machine learning right now, but it's a conversation I think we might want to have in machine learning, at least as we start to spread machine learning and synthetic data tools to other domains. It also probably means that we could think that we need to reconsider how we evaluate our synthetic data, because at the moment we largely evaluate the synthetic data in terms of how well it will work with the models that we're trying to train using it, or in some way incorporate it into new AI models. But I wonder if we maybe also have to ask how well it represents the original data and not just how well it performs in the models that we're training on it, because we are going to be training our new models on synthetic ontological objects.
Professor, who should be the most concerned about these issues? In scientific context, what should both data users and those responsible for data sharing be thinking about? And in commercial settings, how confident can organizations really be in the robustness and reliability of their synthetic data?
Okay, so this is a really good question, and I don't think there's one answer for it. So for those of you not on YouTube, at the moment I've got a picture of a surfboard, because I think trying to answer that question is a bit like trying to find the sweet spot on your surfboard. And, it kind of depends on the board, it depends on you, how much you weigh, depends on the waves. It's going to depend on a lot of things. The closer you have a synthetic data set that represents your original data set, probably the more it will actually represent the world. But then you're not going to be as clearly creating a new data set that could avoid data regulations or restrictions. You're definitely going to be, maybe risking exposing some of the people or other sensitive data in your data set. And and it's probably not going to contain as much new information for your AIs to train on. And since one of the reasons for creating synthetic data sets is to create more data that can amplify or augment existing data sets, you really do want to create these plausible and implausible variations. So the fewer plausible variations you have, the less new information you'll have, and the less valuable it will be for your AI training. But at the same time, you want it to be very similar to your data. This is a really tricky thing. And I don't think you're going to be able to answer it always for all questions. You have to like reconsider this question for each use of the data set.
Professor, given these challenges, what practical steps can we take to address them? And how can transparency and replicability, such as through open science-oriented README practices, help, and what role might curated synthetic data and tools like analytical software developed from your research play in improving the quality and trustworthiness of synthetic datasets?
Okay, so this is a really good question. You'll note that I mentioned that synthetic data can be evaluated and valued dependent on where it's going to be used. But this is an assertion that not everybody is making. There's an awful lot of ideas out there that synthetic data sets should be produced and then uploaded into data repositories so that anybody can access them and use them to answer other scientific questions. I'm really, really reluctant to say that that's going to be a useful way of using synthetic data, but it is a dream that's out there and it is something that is happening right now. So given that, a year ago, actually it was about a year ago, I started wondering, how are data repositories, which are the recipient of many types of data sets that scientists are producing all over the world and sharing in the really lovely idea that we should have open data for open science, how are data repositories dealing with synthetic data? So I sent out a questionnaire to a bunch of data repositories within the open science community and ask them, okay, so when you have people who are wanting to deposit a synthetic data set, how do you help make that data set transparent, or how do you document it as such? And the answer I got was basically, and nobody had an answer, which I thought was very interesting, that people weren't really actually thinking about it. Or people were maybe thinking about it, but they didn't know how to do it yet. So luckily, I was able to get a bit of research money to create a series of workshops and seminars with the Swedish National Data Service and the UK National Data Service, and bring together the people who usually work around their regulations, or not regulations, but like recommendations for READMEs and metadata practices, and their machine learning departments, and bring them all together and just have a conversation and ask them, well, what can we do? What do we need to do to make synthetic data in line with the open science ideals, which oftentimes are, focused around the FAIR concepts, but like shareability, also reliability, reproducibility, and transparency. And we put together a whole bunch of recommendations from this type of from these workshops, many of which indicated that with synthetic data sets, as with real data sets too, though we're talking more here with synthetic data sets, we need to think about data as both a product, a collection of data points, something that you deposit in a repository, but also a process, something that has been created. So thinking that way about it, we both created a policy document, which is now deposited with the AI Policy Lab up in Umeå, and then also created, through a spinoff that I have, an online resource that's free and open for anybody to use that triggers a bunch of questions for people who might be considering depositing a synthetic data set, and asks them questions about both what's in the data set, what sort of known intersectional hallucinations are they aware of? What sort of edge cases do they think might be missing or that they know are missing? Maybe this will encourage them to go and examine what edge cases are missing, but also what processes and practices were used to create that synthetic data sets, which sort of models, which sort of software, what training data, what heat did they use? What weights did they use? So this is just something that we're starting to push out there. The Swedish National Data Service is encouraging people to use this. The UK Data Service is working on it too. But it's basically a way of saying, yeah, we've got to try to make this more transparent. Now, it's not obvious that everybody is going to put their synthetic data sets up into a repository. So for many users, many producers of synthetic data, users of synthetic data, they're going to simply be doing that within their own little bubble. And for that reason, I think it's also important that I can speak about this with you guys today. Thank you very much for letting me do that. But also that we try to figure out what sort of tools we need to provide users and producers of synthetic data with so that they too become aware of the complexities of the relationship reproduction that's going on in their synthetic data. So this spin-off that I was talking about, we've also spent the last year developing a software suite that helps people both analyze the complexities of their original tabular data, pointing out that there are things like edge cases that they might be really concerned about, but also pointing out that there are relations that they might want to maintain for the questions that they're asking, and then use a couple of different models to synthesize it, and then examine these different synthetic versions to specifically look at things like edge cases, look at representation at the intersectional level, try to think about fairness. Basically, creating a software package that allows people to both to enact what we're calling now the ABCDs of synthetic data, that it should be accurate to a degree, because of course you can't have it be identical, but it should be accurate for the types of questions you're asking, that it should be bespoke. You have to know what you're going to be using that data for, so you should be thinking about how to make it bespoke for those purposes, that it should be curated, that you can't just you do it once and then say that that's done. You have to be curating that data set and thinking about how it will be used in the future for the utility with models, but also how it's representing things in the back, behind it, the ontological aspects. And then finally, that it should be documented. So that this software, for example, documents the entire process and makes it transparent. And it can do this in an automated way, but it does it in a way that is actually documenting what is happening. Because, these, I think, are the really important ways or approaches to making synthetic data that then is both transparent and reliable. And if someone is not interested in doing that and just selling you synthetic data, I'm kind of thinking they're probably just trying to sell you snake oil, because you don't know what's in it and they probably don't know either.
Professor, you use the term intersectional hallucinations to describe impossible combinations that appear in synthetic data, like a 6-year-old doctor receiving a pension. How did you arrive at this concept, and what does it reveal about how AI actually understands people?
So this is also a really good question. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you. The reason that we termed these variations in the data intersectional hallucinations stems from the fact that our initial experiments were being based on census data. And we did that because census data is so easy for us to understand. So when we started to look at it, we were able to see that, okay, we suddenly have, for example, 6-year-old medical doctors who are receiving a pension. This is obviously not something that happens in the real world, but it's something that's happening in our synthetic data. And the reason it's happening is that the different elements in the data are changing their relations to each other. Now, this is really easy to understand when it is human data, but it's a phenomena of the synthesis process, the synthesizing process, that will happen regardless of what type of data you have. So if you're working with deep sea currents and salination and temperature variations, you will also, if you synthesize it, have different types of intersectional hallucinations occurring in it. These are not necessarily a bad thing. My research engineer, who I keep working with, keeps reminding me that we need these types of variations, plausible and implausible ones, preferably the plausible ones, so that we can have new information in the data set. But we also need to know where they are, so that if we have variations that are really going to be changing the ontological objects of our data set, we can know that ahead of time and hopefully learn how to control for that, so that the ones that are completely implausible, like a 6-year-old doctor getting a pension, don't end up in the data. So, okay, we use the term intersectionality as our basis for this because I think many people already understand what the concept of intersectionality is. And if not, it's pretty easy to Google and you can figure out that it means that, it's talking about the relationship between gender and class and age, or race or ethnicity or place where you live. It's talking about the way that we are complex beings and data is complex as well. But it's really a way of trying to get people to think about the fact that data sets, tabular data sets, are collected and organized the way they are because we are interested in the relations between the columns. And that's something we want to try to, even though we can't maintain it in order to create new synthetic data, we want to try to maintain that at some level for some of the questions. Now, this brings us to the point that because they're going to be because intersectional hallucinations are going to be existing, regardless of you can't get away from it if you're making synthetic data, you probably want to try to think about which hallucinations you're willing to allow and which ones are not going to be important. And again, this brings up the idea then that synthetic data sets to be useful need to be bespoke, because we need to make sure that we are allowing for these variations to occur in places where maybe they're not as important for what we're going to use that data set for. But we need to maintain the relationships in the data set for things that we are actually very interested in.
Dr. Ericka, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For listeners working with AI systems, whether in hospitals, companies, or public agencies, what concrete steps should they take to detect, monitor, and manage intersectional hallucinations in their training data before those systems are used to make real decisions about people's lives?
Okay, so this is a good question because I think it forces us to think about the process of synthetic data generation as something that happens in a larger practice or a larger, we talk about pipelines sometimes, but in a larger process than just at the moment of generation. If you agree with me that a synthetic data set needs to both be accurate and bespoke and curated and documented, then I think you're on board with the idea that the bespoke data sets need to be created for a particular purpose. This means we need to understand what that purpose is ahead of time. So regardless of if you're working in a scientific domain with a research project and a research question, or if you're working in a commercial field and you have a particular reason for using the data, in order to have synthetic data that will actually help you, you need to be very clear about what the use case is for that data. And I would argue that the use case is not only the model that you're going to train on it, which is our way of thinking about it now. The use case is also related to the representation of the world that you've actually gathered the data in the first place for. There are all sorts of theoretical terms to explain this. One of them that we use a lot is our data is situated, our research is situated, our knowledge is situated. It's dependent on the context. But it's also related to the fact that all data is simply a flattening of the world. We've already made very clear decisions about what aspects of the world we're interested in when we collect data in the first place. Now, if we're going to transform that data one more time into synthetic data, we also still have to be very clear in our heads about what questions about the world and that data are we asking when we make the synthetic data. Because which questions those are is going to change what usefulness the synthetic data is. So we talk about accurate, bespoke, curated, and documented. And I think all of those are really true. But I think if I was going to tell your listeners to have one take home with them around synthetic data tonight, it would be this. Think about what you want to use your data for, what you're actually asking of the world through your data, and make sure that you're actually going to be able to answer that with the synthetic data as well. So you have to situate your synthetic data by knowing your question.
Thank you, Professor Ericka Johnson, for these rich and thought-provoking conversations today. Your insights into how data, technology, and AI reshape our understanding of bodies, identities, and fairness have given us a powerful new lens on the world we are building. As we navigate our future increasingly driven by synthetic data and automated systems, your work is a vital reminder that the question of power, representation, and responsibility can never be left to the technical layer alone. We are grateful that you could share both the complexities and the possibilities with us. On behalf of Business Talk, thank you once again for your time, your clarity, and your generosity in sharing your research. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepak, for having me here.